stories about water and urban places. This is Ideanthro. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. On today's episode, we have a guest with us. We have John Matthews from the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. Now, in a second, I will get John to tell you a little bit about what that is, but broadly speaking, it's a group of regional development banks, government agencies, some non-profits, private sector in this sustainable water resources management space. But before we do that, I'd like to give a little bit of context as to why we're having this conversation, why John and I, who have only just met, are having this conversation. You might have picked up over the past 12 to 24 months here on Ideanthro and in our broader stormwater and water-sensitive urban zone industry, that there's a common thread, a common discussion emerging, which is asking ourselves, how should we be resourcing and funding water-sensitive urban zone and sustainable stormwater management? We've got all these great ideas and practices that are developing and coming to fruition and maturing quite well. But when we look at the levels of investment and maybe compare that to what we need to do to actually have sustainable urban areas, we're not where we need to be. And so there's discussions about how do we change this investment. There's been interest in, for better or for worse, because there's pros and cons to everything, there's been interest in the American model of stormwater utilities recently in Australia as a way to potentially drive investment. But the reason that we have John here is because recently the Alliance, a consortium of which the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation is a part, published some standards or some criteria for recognising, I suppose, the benefits of water projects and water infrastructure within climate bonds. And this caught my attention, almost less so the criteria, but the bonds part as a way to potentially drive investment in sustainable water projects. So this is a discussion about investment in water projects. That's enough intro from me for right now. Let's get into this. John, first up, welcome along after that long introduction.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be on, Jack.
Cool. Thank you very much. Can you start with maybe just give us a tiny bit of context about the Alliance, but then let's get into discussing water infrastructure criteria and bonds and funding of investment that way.
Sure, absolutely. So the NGO that I lead is called AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and we have a small secretariat. I happen to be based in the U.S., but we have a very broad membership. There are about 1,300 people all over the world that are active inside of AGWA, including many people in Australia. And we also have a close relationship for some of our policy work with the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI, and the World Bank that we do a lot of technical and particularly finance work with. Okay. And as an organization, we're about 8 years old. We are mostly a group of what I think of as water nerds. We're people that we have the typical person in AGWA has a technical orientation. I happen to be a biologist. The co-founder at the World Bank, Diego Rodriguez, he's an economist. We have lots of engineers, lots of governance specialists, hydrologists, finance specialists, and so on. But what unites us, the reason that AGWA was founded and that it persists, is that we all recognize that there's this moment that we're living through right now in which we need to really think about what does sustainable water resources management mean in a time when there's a rapidly changing climate. And so our work broadly falls into technical work and policy work. We won't talk, I assume, today that much about the latter category, but we do have, for instance, an official role in the UNFCCC climate negotiations. We represent the water sector in UNFCCC. But on our technical side, a lot of our work, especially in the beginning, the first 4 or 5 years, really focused on how was it we synthesized the state of the art, the best practices about what climate risk, climate resilience meant for water management. And a very early insight that we had was that one of the most important and useful vehicles for thinking about how to mainstream the insights that we were developing was to work through finance mechanisms. And so even though I'm a biologist, I have gotten very involved in finance. Sometimes I think it's pretty ironic and strange. Um, but we for instance started working in around 2014 in the bonds market, and why? Because bonds are how most water infrastructure are financed, and if you can communicate to both investors and bond issuers uh, uh, about the importance of thinking about and addressing and reducing climate risks, then you have gone a really long way to ensuring that that we're trying to really measure and sustain water resources, not just over a few years or a few decades, but maybe even a century or several centuries.
Okay, so this feels like a good point to, and I gave you a heads up that I'll probably ask you some basic questions here, to
Please.
just get in and define a bond. Because I have a funny feel, like I hear the term, like you hear it on the news in the finance section, but to make it really specific, essentially a bond is a document pertaining to a loan. So you might have people, like to do with my house, for example, there's obviously a loan from the bank to me for the house, and the bond is essentially that document supporting that loan. Is that a fair description?
It is a fair description. You can be even more basic. I mean, a bond is basically just a loan. It's a type of loan,
Okay.
and typically the reason that we fund water infrastructure through bonds, in particular, is that they are normally a self-financed loan, so that the a recipient of that money is actually also the entity that is acting as as their own bank. And the reason that they're doing it is they're creating a financial mechanism with one or normally a very large group of investors in a formal relationship for them to buy a piece of that loan, and so they give money and then they get a payment back with interest. So it's a little bit yeah, maybe it's like a kind of ancient form of crowdfunding.
Yeah, okay. So if
In a
this
way.
was a stormwater project, so say I wanted to build some sort of stormwater project, you're saying I would be setting up the bond, but maybe selling it to 10 of my friends to invest in, and I'm going to pay them interest back. So they get some interest for their money, and I get to build the project I wanted to build.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the kind of if you're buying a house, then you normally you get a mortgage, and that's a loan, and that's between you and a bank. But in this case, if you were to issue a bond to buy a house, there are a whole bunch of special finance criteria that you need to be able to meet to legally issue that bond.
Okay.
Uh, and you'd probably want to make sure that that your friends or neighbors or parents or whoever were, if they're going to buy part of that bond that you're issuing to buy your house, they'd want to make sure that you can actually pay for it. So there are rating agencies, for instance, that they check for the financial risk, and so sometimes you see, like with bonds, like a special financial rating, like a AAA
Yep.
plus or triple B, uh, and and that's not what we're talking about. We're kind of with the criteria that we developed to look at water and climate risk. We said, actually we know that most of the water infrastructure globally is being funded through bonds. Is there a way that we can really show that there is potential climate risk, a climate change risk inside of these projects, and communicate and encourage on the part of issuers for them to demonstrate that they've done good work to reduce those risks, that they've essentially issued a bond that is environmentally friendly and that will be able to perform its functions even with ongoing climate change impacts.
Gotcha. So you said a couple of times that a very large amount of the water infrastructure that's constructed is financed by bonds. Something that I've been wondering about as I've approached this conversation is that a lot of what we're trying to do in, say, water sensitive urban design, the projects that are being built, it's not like starting a business where I might need some capital and then I'm going to make money and profit, and therefore I'd use the profits to pay the interest on the loan. It's more like kind of social or environmental good projects. I'm building a stormwater treatment system, and the benefit is less pollution to the environment, which we all benefit from, but I'm not reaping a profit off it. The sorts of projects that use bonds to finance them, are they projects that are delivering profits and it's the profits being used to pay the interest, or are they social good and it's like the government that's running it that's using taxpayer money to pay the interest on the, how does that typically work?
That's a really good question. So the bond market is almost unimaginably large globally. It's represented in trillions, and at least I think the U.S. dollar and Australian dollar are probably about in parity right now, but it's certainly in trillions in U.S. dollars.
Sure.
And given the size of that, you can imagine that it's funding all kinds of projects. Now there are categories, subcategories of bonds underneath the general category of bonds as a financial instrument. And starting around 2007, a big development bank in Europe came up with an interesting idea. They said, we want to be able to communicate to potential investors that this normally an infrastructure investment is going to have some environmental benefit in addition to whatever it is that the infrastructure itself is designed to do. Let's say it's a wastewater treatment plant or a flood control project, that it is also doing something that is environmentally beneficial. We'll call those green bonds. Mm-hmm. And green bonds as a category stayed a fairly niche area. They for many years, up until maybe around 2010, 2011, they only represented globally a few billion US in investment. And that's across a huge range of projects. And the same European bank, the European Investment Bank, also came up with another category shortly after. They call them climate bonds. So they're intended to have some type of a climate change impact. It might be reducing greenhouse gas emissions, energy efficiency projects, green energy, but more and more also around issues around climate adaptation, how we're adjusting to climate impacts. So that market of green and climate bonds together, out of the, let's say, 3 or 4 trillion in the global bonds market, it represents about 200 billion US.
Okay.
So it's not it's a chunk of change by any standards, but it is definitely a subset of the larger set of bonds. And in both cases, they're not like bond police out there that go enforcing many of the environmental and or climate change claims that are made on green climate bonds. So how does an investor know if it's really doing what it says? And that's where we stepped in. We're part of a consortium with a number of other NGOs, World Resources Institute in the U.S., Ceres in the U.S., CDP in London, and also the Climate Bonds Initiative in London. And these are groups that they work in many countries, and they recognized along with AGWA that actually there was a kind of risk here for these green and climate bonds, that they should be performing an important function, but they might have some risk for credibility. So how do we communicate in an effective way to investors and make sure that we're also really rewarding the best bond issuers for the work that they're doing? And they could be issued by all kinds of entities. Normally, the water projects are issued by public entities like public utilities, sometimes state or provincial governments, or in a few cases even national governments.
Mm-hmm.
But private companies also issue them, and they might be issued, say, for a private sector hydropower dam in South America.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that ties in. I mean, it ties in with why I was asking the question about, are these for-profit investments or for social good? Because one of the things a colleague of mine in Australia, Mark Liebman, has been impressing upon me recently is the fact that at the moment our stormwater industry is very much stuck in the space of treating stormwater as a resource, not as a resource, as a waste product,
Yes.
rather than viewing it as a resource. And yeah, we kind of get that it can be a resource, but I could particularly see situations where if we're treating it as a resource and then there's an ability to harvest it, sell it, then that particularly opens up opportunities for using bonds as the means to get the capital to implement the projects, and that wouldn't necessarily have to come out of the public sector. Then the private sector could be the people who are investing in that.
No, that's exactly right, and I think that the green climate bonds are interesting because they have grown spectacularly, and it's interesting to kind of think about why they're growing spectacularly. So they, from 2007, just a few million, to 2010, maybe 2 billion, to 2018, around 160, 170 billion.
Yeah.
That's remarkable growth. There have been several years where the green and climate bonds market has doubled, and we there's a good chance that this year that we'll go past 200 billion. And go ahead.
Sorry to cut. Do you feel, to what extent, and maybe you don't have a feeling on this, but to what extent is that the type of investment changing from things that weren't green to things that are green, versus people were investing in things that were green, but we couldn't tell it was green because we had no way to measure it?
So that's a really good question. So I'll give you a really good, there's bond, as we've been talking about, as kind of an abstract entity, and there's also kind of a physical bond. And when I was first contacted on behalf of Agua to start working on these criteria, I was emailed by these other 4 NGOs, and I really had to spend about a day on Wikipedia to figure out what a bond was. I mean,
I've got to admit, that's when we went for this conversation. I was on Wikipedia and going, I need some background knowledge to have this chat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not sure that I could write a Wikipedia article on bonds now, but I could at least be a significant contributor on the subject. And one of the first things I did when we started this work was that I reached out to some of the people that had already been working in green climate bonds, and I said, show me what a bond looks like, and show me one that you really like, that you think points the way about where we should be going. And these are as a piece of writing, they're pretty awful. They're designed for insomnia. One of the most memorable that was sent to me was 100 pages, more or less, and it was single spaced print, and I would say all but maybe 600 words, 500 words, somewhere in that range, was actually describing the issuer. In that case, it was a public utility in North America, and its own governance, arrangements, its financial credibility, and then a lot of legal language about how the bond payments were going to occur, and all kinds of contingency issues in case there were problems with the project. So, but the project itself was really, it occupied less than a page.
Yeah, right.
And,
okay.
And I was completely intrigued by that, because this was a climate bond. They were making really bold claims about the climate adaptation benefits that were coming from the project. And as a technical person, as a geek in good standing in the water world, I was really puzzled by that. I thought, why aren't investors more interested in kind of the meat of the issue? How do they really know what they're investing in? And I ended up emailing the CFO, and I said, you're saying that this is an important project. I trust that. I believe that. I think you're a credible organization, but where's your climate vulnerability assessment? Where's your environmental impact assessment? Where is the justification really from an environmental viewpoint about the claims that you're making? And his response was, are those normal things to provide? And I said, in my world, they are. If someone is going to tell me that they're restoring this amount of wetlands, that they're working in an environmental flow program, that they're reducing climate risk for these neighborhoods, then I need to see a documentation of it. And he said, well, personally, I've never seen those things either. They come from another department. And I said, could you call those other departments and just see if they exist, so that when it came to you to actually arrange the finance, that there was something behind it? And he emailed me a few hours later, and he said, you're right. We do have all that stuff. And that particular CFO, he's actually become a huge supporter of this type of work, because he saw, actually, we should be getting credit for all of the important analytical and governance and ecological and engineering analysis that we've been doing all this time. And how do we make sure that investors really know about that?
I like that story, because I see in the space that I work that a lot of the benefit, like when things work and when initiatives change, it's very often because we find these win-win situations where, like, so often we think, oh, it's the environment people versus the finance people or whatever. But very often the things that work is just when people take the time to find the common ground and realize that it's in their interest. So I really like that story of the CFO. Yeah, finding that information and realizing that it's of use in his world, not just in the space that it came from. Okay, so this is where the need for this criteria that Agua's developed is to bring that which was there but hidden and bring it into the light of day, so to speak, so people can compare. Oh, if I'm looking at that bond or that bond, know what's what and how things stack up.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, gotcha.
And I'd even go farther. I mean, I think that investors in general are becoming much more interested in that larger bond market, the kind of unlabeled bond market. That they're not. These are bonds that they're not issued as a green or climate bond. And if you look in the financial literature now, I read that literature pretty regularly. You can see this kind of deep concern on the part of a lot of financial analysts that actually this is the environment or climate change. These are not just environmental issues. These are actually core financial issues, and that they affect the financial viability of the project or the investment. And that if we don't understand what those risks are, if they're not transparent to us, then they probably are not worth really investing in as a kind of long-term project. And that's a transformation that basically is shifting the concern from being a greenie issue to being an economic issue. It's a profit and loss issue,
Yep.
and that's a big transformation. So we had a big bond issuance that came out this last summer from another public utility, again a North American utility. They used our criteria, and one of the things that the CFO from that organization told me was that the rating agency that he was working with, that looks at their financial credibility, that they actually gave them a higher rating, which meant that they got a lower interest rate.
Yes.
Because they had used this formal set of criteria to look at the ecological, environmental, and climate change risks that were embedded in their project, and that's enormous. That really is kind of a game-changing issue, not just for the financial world. I would actually say for the environmental movement globally, because it is what we've always hoped for, that governments and companies would start to recognize that actually that green is also a financial good.
Yes. It makes total sense. I really like the sound of it. I'm conscious that we're getting close to time, so I'd like to just, I suppose, ask you a couple of short, well, maybe they're not short. We'll try and keep them short, but we'll see how these go. Questions. So, because you relayed to me essentially your story, you come from a technical non-finance background, but then obviously immersed yourself in this world because you saw potential here and dove in. So for me or anyone else in the stormwater industry, let's see what you can suggest in these terms. One of the things that we've had this conversation that struck me, because we kind of touched on the topic of things that are hiding in plain sight. Right. I have come into this assuming that there's not actually, the bonds aren't being used to finance stormwater or water-sensitive urban design investment. But I recognise from this conversation that perhaps they are. Where would you suggest that if I or someone else in the industry wanted to find out to what extent bonds are actually already investing in our industry, how would you suggest I went about that?
That's a really great question. I actually would like to think that, in effect, what we have found ourselves doing over the past few years, Agua and these other groups, is that we've helped engineer a kind of hostile environmental takeover of a financial instrument. And I would encourage others to take part of that hostile takeover. I would say, look at the categories of institutions that are involved in stormwater. In most cases, it's going to be governments, not exclusively, but for the most part. And they're probably going to be at the city level, or maybe kind of urban landscape level, multiple cities. Yep. Could also be like at a state level, and to think, where how are they doing finance now? Mm-hmm. And the advantage is really about a green climate bond in general are that if you are issuing a bond, that these sell like hotcakes. They are bought up very aggressively. 800 million, 1 billion US dollar bonds can sell in an hour or two.
Right.
And what's driving it from the investor side is especially large pension funds, European, North American, Australian, that they actually have growing limits on the amount of money that on how they guide their investments. They're the people that are paying into those pensions. They want to know that they're not making the climate worse, that they're not doing environmentally toxic investments. And so the kind of standards are actually ratcheting up on these large pools of investment money, and they have kind of fewer places to go. So there's a very high level of demand, and there's still a relatively small amount of supply. So what's holding back the issuers from going with a green or climate bond instead of maybe a more generic a type of bond that's not been labeled. With many of those entities, they feel like they that there are, to use a kind of a financial geek term, that there are high transaction costs, and that they're concerned about those transaction costs, and they don't want them to be too elevated, so that they don't want to have to do a big analytical process. But what our argument is, and I think what maybe the listeners here and yourself in your own work should be arguing is, actually, you probably are already doing that work. Your engineering department is already working along these lines.
Gotcha.
And if the obstacle is like on nature-based solutions, let's say green or hybrid investments,
yep,
those are the ones that seem to be selling really quickly, actually, as bond issuances. That if they're credible to investors, that they're going to get really excited about it. So I actually think that, as people who are maybe engineers or biologists, or that we don't have a finance background, actually to say, look, maybe one of the things that I can do to help you in that transition is I can help lower some of those transaction costs. I can maybe help you communicate within your own organization, or I can help support those technical teams in applying some of these risk filters and helping to apply these criteria. So you have a high scoring and very appealing bond.
Gotcha. Okay, I love it. Final question before we wrap up, which is essentially, if people want to find out more about Agua or the criteria that you have developed, where should they go?
Great question. That you can go look at the criteria today. We have an extensive set of documents that apply to both gray and green and hybrid solutions. We have a scoring guide. We have a background and briefing document that you can use when you're talking with issuers or with investors as well. That's all available at climatebonds.net. And you look into the sectoral guidelines and go to water. About 150 people or so all over the world were involved in their development. It's a very interdisciplinary, very comprehensive process. If you want to learn about Agua, then which I highly encourage, and if you would like to join Agua, there's no membership fees or anything. We're really a network that is interested in improving the work. Building on the optimism and energy of our members. We have two websites. One of them is kind of an overview website and also focuses more on our policy work. That's alliance4water.org. And then we have the kind of more technical guidelines and best practices website. There's also some information about our finance work more broadly than just bonds there too. And that's at guide.org.
Okay, wonderful. So people have got a number of different things they can follow up there. So John, thank you for taking the time to have a chat. I know it took us a little bit of bouncing around to find this time, but I have really enjoyed it, and I've learned plenty of things, and I'm inspired to dig into this a little bit more. So thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Jack. I really enjoyed the conversation too.
Cool. Okay, let's leave it there. And as always, thank you everyone for tuning in and listening. Take something away from this, go and pursue this, learn a little bit more about it, and let me know how you go. We'll see you next time.
Before you go, our best episodes come from your questions. This knowledge base, these discussions that are Ideanthro, improve with your contribution. So if there's a topic, an idea, a concept that you would like us to explore, come and ask us. You know where to find us. www.ideanthro.com/contact. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and that place you get your good podcasts from. You know where to find us. We look forward to hearing from you. We'll see you soon.